sexy guys do. Explore what's soul in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'll be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, one of the things that's been on my mind lately is Halloween, which as we record it is 1 week away. I don't know what it's like locally, but here in Seattle, the Halloween decorations have been going up in September lately. I don't know why you need plastic skeletons climb their way out of the earth in September, but people get excited about putting these things up. And Halloween has always been a holiday that kind of puzzles me a little bit because it's so much out of step with other popular American holidays. It's about ghosts and witches and nasty things to grab you in the dark, and it's about scaring people, but it's also about children. And it's about death, but it's also about candy. And it's got this weird mix of elements that just seems so unique within the landscape of American holidays that it poses the question for me, how did it become so popular, and why does it seem to be getting more popular every year? So I sent you off on the exploration of this holiday, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you learned.
Yeah, Mark, it's a good question as usual. But before I answer, here's a quick message from a friend of this podcast.
You're despicable.
Yes, Daffy, I agree. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller is a despicable human being. I don't know whether Miller was abused as a child or whether his mother just didn't love him, but the zeal with which he crafts President Trump's policy to rid our nation of immigrants and the cruelty with which he implements that policy reveal the depth of his profoundly squalid brokenness as a human being. Now, you're probably wondering what this has to do with the question about Halloween. Here's the connection. Just as we traced the history of potatoes and tomatoes in our last episode as a metaphor for successful immigration, so too am I going to tell the story of Halloween as a centuries-long tale of immigration and assimilation. Halloween became a big deal in the United States and then a distinctly American holiday export through a process that transformed ancient Celtic and Catholic traditions brought to our shores by immigrants. Its enduring popularity reflects the juxtaposition of that history with other factors like Americans' deep-seated fascination with the supernatural and our bottomless appetite for consumerism, and we'll get into all of that. But the delicious stew cooked in that melting pot of cultural influences would not have happened if we had not been a nation of immigrants. Halloween is another shining example of that lovely word you turned me on to during our podcast about the origins of Christmas. Syncretism, the blending of old religious beliefs, cultures, or philosophies to create something new. Which is to say, Mark, Halloween is what happens when your country is not run by xenophobes like Donald Trump and Stephen Miller. Okay, let's start with some history. I was surprised to learn that it wasn't until large waves of Irish and Scottish immigrants arrived on our shores in the 1840s and 1850s that Halloween celebrations first became widespread in the U.S. The Scotch-Irish came to America fleeing the crushing poverty brought about by the potato famine that you referenced in our last episode. These immigrants brought with them folk customs from the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain. It's spelled Samhain, but it's pronounced Samhain. It's a Gaelic word meaning summer's end. Samhain was a 3-day festival that took place around November 1st and was observed by the Celts of Ireland, Scotland, and northern France. It marked both the end of the Celtic year and the transition between the harvest and the start of winter, when the nights got longer and colder, a time long associated with death. Part of the tradition was to tell scary stories, which is the likely source of Halloween's association with frightfulness. The Celts believed that spirits roamed the earth at that time of year, and sacred rituals, including crop and animal sacrifices, were required to appease all the wandering souls, blurring the boundary between the living and the dead. They lit bonfires, believing the bonfire's flames guided their ancestors' spirits home while keeping harmful spirits away. They wore costumes of animal heads and skins and left offerings of food outside their homes as gifts for the friendly spirits. As you can already tell, many of the activities that are part of Halloween celebrations today trace their roots back to those ancient rituals of protection and appeasement.
I remember from my study of religion that there's a term called liminality, which refers to rituals and practices that are performed at points that are in between one place and another. So, for instance, in a initiation ritual, if a boy is becoming a man, there's this liminal period where he's halfway in between those states. And so that applies to something like Halloween, because as you mentioned, it's at the border between summer and winter. And liminal periods within world religions often feature reversals of norms. The dead walk the earth. The rules and laws are overcome. Humans become animals. And so many of those things show up within Halloween still to this day, but without that religious discourse around it, probably nobody has any idea why that would be the practice, but is rooted back in some very, very old religious ideas.
Yeah, that's interesting, and thank you for bringing it up, because I think as I proceed here, you're going to see how the blending of all these traditions around this liminal time has really created this rich stew that we call Halloween today. By AD 43, most Celtic territory had been conquered by the Roman Empire, and Samhain took on aspects of the Roman festivals of Feralia, honoring the dead, and Pomona, the goddess of fruit and trees, the latter of which might explain the Halloween custom of bobbing for apples. Late October and early November was also the time in the Christian liturgical year dedicated to remembrances of the dead. And as Christianity spread across Europe, the Catholic Church purposely synchronized some of its holidays with the ones observed by its new congregants. Halloween is an amalgam of the Celtic Samhain and the Catholic All Saints' Day, the latter of which was moved from mid-May to November 1st by Pope Gregory III in the 8th century AD, in part to co-opt Samhain's rituals. Catholicism's blending of pagan rituals with its own theology resulted in the creation of All Hallows' Eve, the evening preceding All Saints' Day, in which people pulled pranks on each other and told ghost stories. The name Halloween itself is a shortening of All Hallows' Eve, where hallow means saint or holy person, and the E-E-N at the end means evening.
Yeah, and isn't it so interesting that we still have All Hallows' Eve, but we no longer widely practice the All Saints' Day that followed it? Like it's almost like a leftover, a partial relic of a previous practice that had a beginning and an end, and the only part that's left over is the beginning.
Yes. Well, I think two things come to mind. The first is that we've gotten less and less religious over time. So there are fewer religious holidays that are celebrated. But the other thing, which fits my immigration assimilation theme, is that all the events of All Saints' Day kind of got smushed together into this thing we call Halloween that just happens to be the day before.
Yeah.
According to the folklorist Jack Santino, the Irish recorded their traditions in sagas written between the 9th and 12th centuries, by which time they had been thoroughly blended with Christian beliefs, And in that way, the cultural melting pot I'm talking about had already begun to churn centuries before these traditions found their way into what became the United States. This fusion of Celtic and Christian beliefs and customs added moral ambiguity to its characters. For instance, in Celtic mythology, fairies were seen as benevolent beings, but in Christianity they became fallen angels. Similarly, Christians branded the followers of pagan traditions as demonic witches. The most enduring example of Celtic-Christian blending is the jack-o'-lantern, an Irish legend that started with the story of a blacksmith and drunkard named Stingy Jack, who outsmarted the devil, but because he was too sinful for admission to heaven, was instead condemned to wander the earth in perpetuity, with only a glowing ember of coal inside a turnip to light his path. That became the basis for the carved Halloween pumpkins we see today.
So it seems that we have narrowly evaded a practice of carving turnips for Halloween, which seems like it would have a less dramatic effect than a big old pumpkin.
Yes, turnips are old world, right? And pumpkins are new world. So the people who used to put the glowing coal ember in the turnip to celebrate the old holiday realized that, ooh, there's this bigger, more robust thing I can put the glowing ember in called a pumpkin in the new world. And that's basically why pumpkins were swapped out for turnips.
Yeah.
Before the Irish migration to America, Halloween celebrations consisted of harvest-related play parties, only in Catholic-dominated Maryland and some southern colonies, featuring general mischief-making and the telling of ghost stories. In Protestant New England, rigid belief systems and the pervasive Puritan disdain for the heathen forbade such celebrations. As Irish immigrants flooded into America, their Celtic Catholic customs shaped Halloween while simultaneously shifting to fit an American social and cultural context. For example, the Puritans' fear of witchcraft, already present in America for centuries before the Irish arrived, tempered the holiday celebrations. As the history professor Stephen Mintz put it, quote, beginning in the 1870s, Halloween became less about warding off spirits and more about community-oriented fun and mischief. Activities like pumpkin carving, wearing costumes, and trick-or-treating grew widespread as the holiday transitioned into a playful celebration of the macabre and mysterious. End quote. Halloween also began to shed its religious overtones, becoming more of a child and community-focused holiday. As the Scotch-Irish immigrants settled into their new lives, magazines published stories about their quote-unquote quaint celebrations, and that caught the attention of American mothers, who began hosting Halloween parties for their children. Trick-or-treating was a reimagination of the centuries-old British custom of going souling, which was where children visited neighborhood homes and prayed for the souls of that family's dead relatives in exchange for gifts of money, ale, and food, especially soul cakes, which was a sweetbread.
Wait a minute, you're telling me that there was an old English custom in which children would go door to door, pray for the souls of the dead, and then sometimes be given ale or beer in exchange?
Yes.
Like pray for the dead and give children alcohol.
Yes.
Yes, it's a very wholesome tradition you're imagining there.
A lot of kids drank alcohol in those days. There's stories about the pilgrims, and because they didn't trust the water supply in the New World, their kids drank ale during the day. That's for real.
Yeah.
Though the term trick-or-treating really didn't enter the American lexicon until the 1930s, trick-or-treating grew in popularity in the late 19th century as a way to distract the young nation's kids, who by 1900 had progressed from mischievous pranks played on farmers, like tipping over outhouses, to orchestrated acts of urban vandalism. To address this juvenile crime wave, community leaders tried to curb the holiday's more destructive and grotesque elements. They promoted wholesome, family-friendly events centered on neighborly gatherings, the sharing of seasonal foods, and games like bobbing for apples, successfully shifting the focus away from ghosts and mischief. Meanwhile, newspaper editors gleefully covered the stories of mayhem while dripping with condescension about the holiday's long-term prospects. In my research for this episode, Mark, I read an article from the November 1st, 1876 edition of the New York Times commenting about that year's Halloween celebrations. Titled, "The Decadence of Halloween," it referred to the holiday as the sole province of older folks of Scotch-Irish descent who would soon die off, intoning, quote, "The glory of this once popular festival has departed. Its triumphs, rough jollities, and strange rites are a matter of history," end quote. But the rumors of Halloween's imminent death were, as the saying goes, greatly exaggerated. Indeed, what started as a solemn Celtic ritual to guard against the supernatural would eventually become one of America's most popular secular holidays, incorporating ancient fears with modern playfulness.
So are you suggesting that Halloween itself has risen from the dead?
Yeah, in some ways it has, yeah. And as people try to get rid of certain aspects of the holiday, they keep coming back. In the years leading up to World War II, Halloween still retained an element of fear and even danger, with some of those juvenile pranks crossing the line into destructiveness. By Halloween 1933, no doubt exacerbated by the Great Depression, vandalism had escalated to the point that the damage nationwide was in the millions of dollars, and that year's holiday became known as Black Halloween. A New York Times article about that time stated, quote, "Communities needed a way to buy off gangs of feral children who were terrorizing neighbors by smashing light fixtures, setting tires on fire, and even tripping people on sidewalks," end quote.
I just have to say I love that phrase, buying off gangs of feral children.
Yes. It was a different time.
As if they're tearing at raw meat.
Yep, a different America than you and I knew. Whereas other American holidays like Thanksgiving or Mother's Day had quickly become popular, it took a while for Halloween to shake its dodgy image. The post-World War II period saw Halloween's rough edges systematically sanded down and sanitized, its more sinister aspects downplayed and reinvented as a fun, family-friendly celebration of childhood innocence in which kids engaged in harmless costumed cosplay in exchange for candy. This shift reflected a broader cultural trend. America, having just vanquished the scary, evil specter of worldwide totalitarianism, wanted to instill in its people a sense of normalcy and security. In the words of Professor Mintz, quote, "Halloween became an outlet for playful imagination, nostalgia, and a controlled exploration of fear. Children could dress up as spooky characters, witches, ghosts, vampires, without any real danger, turning what was once a night of eerie uncertainty into a safe and whimsical tradition," end quote. It should come as no surprise that the rise of Halloween as a significant national holiday dovetailed with the rise of consumer culture in the second half of the 20th century. In the decades before the post-war era, kids would dress in whichever of their parents' old clothes they found in their attics. But beginning in earnest with the baby boom in the 1950s, costume retailers and candy manufacturers seized on the end of wartime sugar rationing to market trick-or-treating to their newly ascendant suburban family. This explosion of economic activity established Halloween as a still-growing economic colossus, firmly ensconced in the top tier of holidays behind the juggernaut of Christmas, which we already discussed in episode 12 of this podcast. According to the National Retail Federation, this year, 2025, American consumers will spend about $13.1 billion on candy, costumes, decorations, greeting cards, and party supplies to celebrate Halloween, up from $3.3 billion in 2005. About 72% of the American public participates in at least one aspect of Halloween, and that number rises to 95% if you include candy consumption. In a frightening case of holiday creep, Halloween ads and marketing begin as early as the summer, which you mentioned when you teed up this question for me. Halloween is a marketer's dream in that it falls on the same day every year. Its staple items like individually wrapped candy and mass-manufactured costumes must be replaced each year, and its most popular costumes often derive from pop culture trends. This year, K-pop Demon Hunters is the runaway bestseller. And now the Americanized version of Halloween, a mashup of cultural influences, few of which originated here, has gone global, slowly infiltrating other countries around the world. For example, before this century, Halloween celebrations were non-existent in Hong Kong. Nobody even knew what it was. But starting in 2001, the second largest theme park in the region has hosted a huge multimedia Halloween bash that now attracts 500,000 visitors every year.
Wow.
Though Halloween isn't celebrated as extravagantly in Europe, the glut of American tourists and expatriates in its major cities made it popular in those places. There's also some holiday commonality across nations. Spain and Mexico celebrate a Day of the Dead in early November that, much like Halloween, blends Catholic and indigenous traditions.
Yeah. It strikes me, thinking a little bit back to our previous episode on tomatoes and potatoes, how there's sort of this recurrent pattern where something originates in one place, it goes to a different part of the world, gets recombined and then sent back out, where I'm thinking about traditions that gain force through that syncretistic act of being mixed up with other thing and then re-exported, where in its original form it might have been culturally or historically limited, but in its combined form it gains new force, new potency, maybe because it can simply hit more notes and appeal to a wider range of people.
Yes, there's that, and also I'm thinking about how a lot of these traditions independently arise in different places, and they had no cross-fertilization, but the Day of the Dead in Mexico and Samhain in Ireland, right? These people never spoke to each other until a few centuries ago, and yet they had the exact same tradition at the exact same time of year. So nothing is original, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, certain elements, particularly things that are fundamental, like death and our relation to the dead and the fear of the dark, those are probably going to be cultural universals because they plug into basic elements of the human brain. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, that liminality theme, which is not specific to any religion. It tends to pop up across religions where we tend to imbue things that are at the border between one state and another with a particular force and potency, which is as dangerous as well as possibly productive. And so it doesn't surprise me that two widely disparate traditions would have a common element of a day, a ritual period in the year when the dead are allowed to walk the earth, because that's a simple binary that's been inverted in a way that you would expect different traditions to make the same move.
Yes, I agree entirely, and I would only add that the timing element is also not surprising, right? So these traditions are going to talk about the dead at the time when the crops die, at the end of the harvest, when it gets cold and dark, you know? Yeah. So we shouldn't be surprised that the timing is the same as well.
Yeah, certain features of human existence on the planet circling the sun encourages certain types of reflection at certain times of the year. You're least likely to think about the dead on July 4th. Right. You are most likely to think about the dead when it's cold and dark and you're worried about whether or not you have enough food for the winter.
Right. Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us. Because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really. All right, well, let's bring all this history into the present. In recent decades, Halloween has been young adultified, with costume parties and parades increasingly challenging trick-or-treating for the most popular activity. A National Retail Federation spokesperson told the New York Times that 3/4 of millennial and Gen Z adults actively celebrate Halloween. My research yielded a few explanations for that. One is the influence of pop culture. The desire for escapist entertainment in the 1970s and 1980s prompted a torrent of media embracing the darker, scarier side of the holiday. I'm thinking now of the John Carpenter film Halloween with Jamie Lee Curtis that came out in 1978, which became one of the most influential and successful slasher films of all time, spawning a 13-film franchise and countless copycats. Just like the holiday they're exploiting, horror movies tap into psychological dynamics like the perception of fear, especially when it takes place in a controlled environment where we can confront it safely. Our control of the situation, we can leave that haunted house or movie theater whenever we like, transforms our perceived fear into a thrilling emotion that we safely explore in community with others, a phenomenon that's often wildly contagious. Young adults also gravitate to themed, mass-produced costumes based on whichever movie, TV show, or celebrity is trendy at the time. Think about how many people dressed up as Barbie or Ken a couple of years ago when the Barbie film came out.
Yeah.
Or the ubiquity of Marvel, DC, and Disney characters at costume parties.
Right.
A big part of Halloween's enduring appeal and continued significance for young people is its ability to blend historical and modern elements so seamlessly.
Right. Plus, there's the obvious power of social media in this, like where, as you say, young adults spend their entire day on social networks. And this time of year, I'm seeing a large number of young women on social media sharing their plans for their Halloween costume on their networks. The cliche is that, sexy nurse, sexy taxi cab driver, sexy this, sexy that is the theme to every Halloween costume.
Right.
And so there's an element of pushing boundaries in a way
Yes.
which does seem liminal at first sight, because liminality is about flopping standards and turning things on their heads. And so you could say that pushing sexual mores is a liminal element, but it's also a very commodified element, like you say. There's a conformist element, which is kind of the opposite of liminality. So it's both liminal and it's not. It's both individual and conformist. And then also my mind goes to a famous line from the movie Mean Girls, where one of the Mean Girls says to the other that Halloween is the one day of the year when a girl can dress like a total slut and nobody can say anything about it. And that was intended as a joke, but it locks into this element of Halloween as the one day a year when you can be completely outrageous, and it is expected that you be outrageous. And so it's both an outrage and not an outrage at the same time in a way that I find super interesting.
Yes. And smart guy that you are already jumping ahead to some of my answers to your second question, which is about why does Halloween have such legs in America today? There's the idea of Halloween as a laboratory for subverting norms and exploring one's identity. The anthropologist Jack Kugelmass has pointed out how the emphasis on costuming oneself resonates strongly with the LGBTQ plus community, as it affords an opportunity to explore facets of their personalities without the usual constraints of societal approval. For the many young LGBTQ plus adults who flock in droves to the world's largest Halloween parade, held in Greenwich Village in New York City, which features among its 70,000 costumed participants the cleverest and most risque costumes you'll ever see anywhere. Halloween is most certainly a prime time for exploring transgressive aspects of one's identity in a festive, non-judgmental setting. And speaking of transgressive acts, the last decades of the 20th century also saw the reemergence of more violent iterations of Halloween. Devil's Night, the night before the holiday, became notorious in Detroit, Michigan, for urban unrest, including vandalism, property destruction, and arson. In Bayonne, New Jersey, where I grew up, we called it Mischief Night. And it was truly scary to be out on the streets because you could end up getting pelted with eggs or slugged in the head with a sack of flour by roving bands of scary teenagers. And knowing what you were like as a young man, Mark, I can only assume you were the leader of one of those gangs of masked thugs roaming the streets of Eugene, Oregon.
Well, as you say yourself, masked thugs, so nobody can prove anything. But no, I have to say, the first time I heard the term Devil's Night, the very first time, I was an adult watching the movie The Crow, where Devil's Night is an element of the plot, and I had no idea what they were talking about. It was not something that was part of my life on the West Coast.
Oh, interesting.
But I do know the experience of being pelted with eggs on Halloween, because when I was in graduate school on October 31st, I was riding home on my bike after dark, and someone pegged me with an egg as I went by.
Interesting. Must be a Northeast thing then, right? You went to grad school in the Northeast.
Yeah.
So here's another noteworthy thing that happened in the 1970s vis-a-vis Halloween. And it's something you alluded to when you gave me this question last time. The backlash to Halloween that arose in fundamentalist Christian circles. Fundamentalists abhorred Halloween's ritualized focus on death and darkness and its elevation of occult symbols like ghosts, which they saw as satanic in nature. And the holiday's pagan origins and association with the Celtic Samhain festival certainly didn't help. Dressing in costumes depicting monsters, witches, and other supernatural beings was deeply problematic because it trivialized and even glorified evil. For children to engage with such demonic themes was seen as morally wrong. As for the tradition of trick-or-treating, in which children demanded candy from strangers, fundamentalists thought it promoted greed and disrespect for authority, behaviors regarded as contrary to the values of self-discipline and obedience that families were supposed to inculcate in their children.
Not to mention the fact that those children are going door to door asking for a handout, like charity,
yes,
like as if they're asking for Social Security benefits. You don't want to encourage that sort of dependency. Those kids should be out working their jobs, earning a solid wage, and paying for their own candy.
Yeah. What happened to rugged individualism, right? Yeah. But all those efforts by the fundamentalists came to no avail because in America, where mammon and not God is the primary source of worship, all that fundamentalist Bible thumping hasn't made a dent in Halloween's popularity, which is still growing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my discourse on how Halloween became such a big deal. I want to pivot now to your second question about what Halloween's enduring popularity says about America. I have a few thoughts. First, as I already mentioned, It provides a controlled and playful environment in which Americans can explore primal fears and the supernatural, or as Professor Mintz put it, quote, a cultural mechanism for managing our deepest anxieties about death, the unknown, and social boundaries, end quote. Numerous psychologists have written that the holiday allows adults to confront their anxieties about mortality and the unknown in a safe communal setting. For kids, it's a chance to temporarily invert typically forbidden social norms by dressing as monsters and trooping onto unfamiliar property to ask total strangers to give them candy. Like horror movies and haunted houses, it also offers an exhilarating escape from the mundane. It's fun to indulge in a simulation of fear that Duke psychology professor Tamar Kushner described as, quote, a way to practice and enjoy the experience of being afraid, a way of playing with emotion without real cost, end quote. The hormonal cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol induced by fear also triggers endorphins that create a feeling of euphoria, like after you step off a roller coaster.
I was just thinking about roller coaster and also horror movies.
Yes.
The core experience of the horror movie is to be scared in a way that is not actually dangerous.
Yes.
And so you can feel that rush without actually being frightened of anything real.
Yes. So my second thought is that Halloween offers Americans a chance to break from their everyday social norms and connect with neighbors in a spirit of community. Of course, the act of sharing scary stories is as old as humanity itself and among the earliest communal experiences that strengthen social bonds. Halloween embellishes this experience as neighborhoods come alive with trick-or-treaters, parades, and costume parties. Decorating the outside of one's house, wearing strange or funny costumes to go trick-or-treating, and attending Halloween parties foster creativity and strengthen social bonds. One San Diego homeowner whose elaborate house decorations are beloved by local families and attract visitors from as far away as Europe told the New York Times, quote, I've met so many people and neighbors that I wouldn't have met if it wasn't for doing this, end quote. Thirdly, the explosive commercial evolution of Halloween is Exhibit A for how American consumerism takes historical traditions and transforms them into excuses to buy shit. And I use the word shit advisedly because after having bought way too many Halloween costumes for my kids over the years, I can attest firsthand to how shoddily manufactured they were.
Mm-hmm.
The ginormous sales of candy, decorations, and costumes underscore America's deep affinity for buying and selling disposable crap. Moreover, Halloween's targeted advertising campaigns, aided and abetted by social media influencers, as you mentioned, exploit our psychological pressure points, like the fear of missing out and the desire to conform to societal norms. I can hear it now. Everybody else is dressing as a K-pop demon hunter this year, Mommy, so how can you deny me? In this way, the holiday and its celebrants are both commodified. And commodification, as we all know, is as American as apple pie.
Yeah, you know what strikes me like overarching throughout all of this is the extent to which we are largely unconscious participants in our own culture. You know, like here's a tradition, Halloween, which has historical roots that goes back thousands of years and has fundamental elements like the phrase trick or treat that's based in practices that have fallen out of use, and we still have the saying, and kids mouth the phrase without knowing where it comes from. And parents dress their children in costumes without understanding why that's a practice. And it's such a good example of what's just probably universal, that there's hardly an activity that we engage in as a culture where we're fully cognizant of what we're doing. We just follow the rules of the occasion, fall into the patterns of the holiday without really reflecting on where they came from or why we're doing that, other than simply that's how it's done.
Yeah, but what you say is true. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I had no idea, zero idea that Halloween was something that basically came to our shores with Irish and Scottish immigrants 160, 170 years ago.
Yeah.
I would never have guessed that. I would have assumed the Pilgrims were doing this, So yeah, it's just something we receive as a birthright, and we just act out these celebrations,
right?
Which makes it interesting to kind of peel back the onion, and like we're doing today, and figure out where this all came from.
Yeah. Though I'm thinking that probably if it had come over with the Pilgrims, people would have been burned at the stake or hung
Yes.
for doing these things.
Yeah.
Because they did burn witches for doing so much less.
Right.
And so it needed to come to America at a point within America's history where imagining the dead walking the earth and telling scary stories would not have been interpreted as being an enemy of God, but just as a fun activity once a year.
Yeah, I mean, the Pilgrims was a bad example, but
overall, this so much put me back to when I was a kid and Halloween would come around. And I don't know how things were for you in Bayonne, but for me, it was a child-dominated occasion. When I was a kid, me and my mother and my sisters were invited to like a grand total of one Halloween party. And I do remember bobbing for apples as one of the activities, because I remember thinking that was a weird thing to do. But otherwise, Halloween was you would put on a costume and then you'd go out with your friends and you'd go door to door until you got tired or it got too late. And there were no adults anywhere. And I know that is one respect in which the occasion has changed. How the trick-or-treating is much more structured and regularized than it used to be. I know here in Seattle, it's pretty common for everyone to agree that the kids are going to go trick-or-treating from here to there between these hours, and there's going to be a parent like every 10 feet.
Right.
And it's a strictly controlled and protected space. When I was a kid, we were on our own.
Yes.
And that was part of the appeal, is that it did feel kind of dangerous.
Yes.
In a way where you both believed that the danger wasn't real, but we also told stories about the bad people who put razor blades in apples.
Yes.
And so in that respect, maybe the danger was real. And so it was a chance for us as children to play with the sort of self-responsibility in the face of danger that we wouldn't otherwise experience in our lives on any other day of the year.
Yeah, let me just say, on bobbing for apples, I was always terrible at it, and it always seemed to me like state-sanctioned drowning exercises, because in order to really get that apple, you needed to expose yourself to the chance of drowning, and I was not good at that, and a little bit more too worried about my own self-preservation to win that contest. But I have one more thing I want to say about the reason what Halloween's popularity says about the U.S. This is the most interesting thing for me. I think that Halloween, with its deep undercurrents of pre-Christian or even anti-Christian traditions, serves as a mirror for our national anxieties. This is kind of the flip side of the first thing I said about how the holiday gives us a safe context for exploring dark ideas. It also gives us an excuse to freak out irrationally. And here's an example of what I mean by that, and it's similar to what you just said. In the 1970s, rising crime and documented child abuse, coupled with eroding family structures and cultural unease about shifting social norms, contributed to a general sense that children were increasingly vulnerable in a dangerous world. Halloween, a holiday in which children ventured into public spaces to interact with strangers, became a focal point for these child-centric anxieties. Those of us who trick-or-treated in the high-crime 1970s remember the widespread rumors about poisoned candy and razor blades inserted into apples, which I think reflected a larger moral panic about stranger danger and the world being a scary and dangerous place for everyone, not just kids. So I'm curious, Mark, did your parents check your Halloween bag for hidden razors or unwrapped candy?
No. I don't remember my father being involved at all, kind of typical of my father. My mother is more of a Halloween optimist, where she would speak to us as just sort of scary stories rather than something that would actually happen. Which is maybe a function of growing up in a college town in Oregon. If you were in Detroit or on the south side of Chicago, there might have been much more real things to be scared of at the time.
Yeah. I certainly was aware of the razor and the apple trick because I heard it a lot as a kid. So somebody must have told me that. My mother probably. And I have a vague recollection of unwrapped candy not meeting with the approval of my overseers. So this subject we're talking about now reminds me of a book I read not long ago called Free Range Kids by Lenore Skenazy. It was one of the most helpful books my wife and I read while raising our kids. Skenazy marshals a ton of data to prove that it's not any actual increase in danger to children, but rather sensationalized media coverage that amplifies social fears and creates the conditions of moral panic in which urban legends about Halloween proliferate and endure into the 21st century. Skenazy's arguments are rendered with such good humor that I want to close this episode with an excerpt from her chapter on Halloween. And I quote, "Halloween is the perfect example of how a fun, even revered childhood activity has been turned into an orgy of worrying. The biggest fear on Halloween, of course, is that your nice, quiet neighbors, the ones you somehow manage to live next to in peace and harmony the other 364 days of the year, have been waiting for this one day to murder local children. Murdering them on another day just wouldn't be satisfying, I guess, which is why they've shown such remarkable restraint. But a child homicide on Halloween, it just feels right." End quote. As we've seen far too often in recent years, that kind of baseless fear, paranoia, and conspiracy theorizing is also uniquely American.
Yeah. My closing thought is just the awareness through your presentation and our discussion here that traditions, we tend to think of them as things that have been handed down to us as complete and final, but traditions are always changing. They are constantly in flux. Halloween has changed from the moment that it was a gleam in an Irish person's eye, and it continues to change to this day, and it will continue to change in the future. And all we can do is sort of take a snapshot of what the thing is today. It'll be different later.
Forgive me, Mark, but I can't help but think of politics when you say something like that. You know, I'm thinking now of the ridiculous Supreme Court originalists who want to interpret the Constitution as it was written 250 years ago and only that way. You know, imagine if we said about Halloween, we can only celebrate it the way they did back in Samhain. So you kiddies, you can only pray for the souls of the dead and receive ale in return. Candy was not part of the original intent of Samhain. The connection I'm drawing is like constitutional jurisprudence. Holidays too are living, breathing documents, you know, that we modify and change every day. And that's the way it ought to be. That's the only way it can be.
Yeah, agreed. But this podcast is also a living and breathing thing, which means that it is now time for us to move on to the topic for the next one. So you have a question for me?
Yes, I do. But I wanted to give you a little quick Halloween trivia quiz before we get to the questions, just to end on something light and fun.
Okay.
It's 5 questions, carefully curated by yours truly to determine your Halloween IQ, Mark. So this first one I think is the easiest.
All right.
In the classic 1966 Peanuts TV special, It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, which character believes in the Great Pumpkin?
Well, that's obviously Linus.
Yes, correct. Okay, sticking with the theme of pumpkins, here's the second question. Which U.S. state produces the most pumpkins?
Well, the truth is I have no idea, but my guess would be something like Vermont.
Oh, interesting. I thought you were going to say California because that's the default for all food production in the U.S. No, it's Illinois, the state where we went to college. Illinois produced 690 million pounds of pumpkins in 2023.
All right. Okay.
Third question. What percentage of Americans believe in ghosts?
I think, well, to really get at this, you'd have to ask them at 2 points. One at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the second at 11 o'clock at night after they just heard something go bump in the air. Well, I do know that about 60% of Americans believe in some spiritual thing. They might not be members of a church, but they describe themselves as spiritual. So I'm going to guess that it's about the same number, 60%.
It's a little bit high. It's actually 40%. And just, I thought, incidentally, 13% of Americans believe vampires are real. So put that in perspective. 2 more questions. What percentage of Americans pretend they aren't at home on Halloween night?
Well, this also is a complicated question because there's the percentage and then there's the percentage of people who admit that that's what they do. So yes. I would say it's probably a pretty low number. About 15% are probably crypto hiders. And so I'm going to say 20%.
I'm going to give that one to you because the answer is 21%. And it's a good intuition that people, I suspect this is the kind of thing that we've all done, but not all of us report this, right?
Yeah.
Okay, here's the last question. It's the hardest one, but it's also the funniest one, I think. What's the origin of the mask that Michael Myers wore in the film Halloween?
Oh, I remember this. It's a William Shatner mask, isn't it? It's supposed to be Captain Kirk from Star Trek.
Oh my God, you got this. I didn't think anybody knew that. You are right. That is correct. It was reconstructed from an old mask of Captain Kirk from Star Trek. The film's production designer shaved off the eyebrows and sideburns, then dyed the hair dark brown. Very good, Mark.
Okay, well, this means my Halloween IQ is very high. And so I feel validated by this test.
Yes. I mean, we knew William Shatner was scary, but you really knew that. All right, it's time for the question for next time. And here it is. Since the pandemic, I've started cooking, something I never really used to do. I cook on the gas stove in my apartment's small and not well ventilated galley kitchen. A few years ago, I started hearing about how gas stoves, which have been popular in our country for at least a century and are favored by professional chefs, are dangerous to your health and should be replaced by electric or induction cooktops. While I don't doubt that that's true, the skeptic in me wants somebody, you, Mark, to answer the following questions. If cooking with gas is so unsafe, how did gas stoves come to be so common in the first place? Why are we only hearing about their dangers now that millions of Americans have them? And how dangerous is the threat to our health of continuing to use them?
Okay, my mind immediately goes to cigarettes, which are once every bit as ubiquitous as gas stoves, and yet which Americans only woke to the dangers thereof, shockingly late within the history of cigarette consumption.
Yes.
And of course, the answer in the case of cigarettes is big tobacco was the one that suppressed knowledge of that. So I'm wondering if there's a big gas that is also suppressing our understanding of gases' risks. But I'm looking forward to getting into this and finding what the answer is.
Yeah, good. I'm glad.
Well, I will go into that, explore that topic for 2 weeks before I come back to you with an answer. In the meantime, our listeners will be celebrating Halloween, hopefully with a little more insightful awareness of the traditions they are following and the practices that they are conforming to. And while they're chewing on the candy, they can be looking forward to that next episode, which we will be bringing to you soon. Until then, this is Mark, and that was Joe. And we'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.
Celtic clan. And I'm no fan of Boston Celtics, man. They dribble weird, their fans are mean, so I curse that whole pagan scene. You say it's ancient history, well, heresy don't feel right to me. I'm sticking to the righteous team, that's why I hate Halloween. They say the spirits rise tonight, but I gave up spirits to live right. No whiskey, rum, or devil's gin, I won't let that darkness in. All that I call hocus pocus keeps good Christians out of focus. It's evil wrapped in cellophane. That's why I hate Halloween. Trick or treating is self-defeating, is doom and gloom. If you're in a costume, worshiping ghouls is for fools. Why do it? Why do it? Screw it. Hard to glimpse God's truth through the candy haze. Repent all of your sugary ways. Can I get an amen? That's why I hate Halloween. Now candy corn's a vile deceit, a waxy hex you shouldn't eat, and horror flicks corrupt the soul. They'll drag you down a brimstone hole. So toss your mask, your plastic sheen, you better stay all squeaky clean. Don't you see what I mean? You better love to hate Halloween. Apple bobbing, cradle robbing, razor boys out there stabbing, demons dancing in the street. You call that fun? It's a bad defeat. Let's raise our hands, turn off the screen, praise the Lord, and give up your sugary dreams. Halloween. Trick or treat is self-defeating, it's doom and gloom. If you're in a costume, worshiping ghouls is for fools. Why do it? Why do it? Screw it. Let's trade in fright for the King of Kings. That's right. Let's all hate Halloween. Trick or treating is self-defeating, it's doom and gloom. If you're in a costume, worshiping ghouls is for fools. Why do it? Screw it. Let's trade in fright for the King of Kings. That's right. Let's all hate Halloween.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.